Good morning, Gil, and good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining this session today. So let's start off with this particular course, which is the Level 3 Award in Assessing Vocationally Related, achievement. Now, before I start, what I want to do is do a quick introduction to what the course is about, how we will cover, and obviously what is expected, as an outcome of this particular course. So just looking at very briefly, this particular course is normally done or studied, by people who want to become assessors, people who want to assess, mark, or look at learners' work, students' work, and they could be at primary, secondary, FE, oblique, HE level. But generally, the assessor course is more done predominantly by people who are essentially going to be marking work at secondary, oblique, FE, and higher education. Now, this particular course is also, important for people who basically look at, assessing work apart from exams. Essentially, when you look at the term vocational, if we use the term vocational and we look at the actual meaning of the term vocational, vocational basically means, when I say vocational education, it also means tertiary education. That means education that prepares people with skills or, provides you skills at the end of it, which will allow you to either enter the job field or, obviously start working with a particular company or an organization. So this particular course, when it says assessing vocationally related achievement, means that people who are going to be working and assessing work, which is for student learners or any sort of people work studying a particular qualification, they would essentially be looking at preparing them and obviously looking at their work, which is going to be assessed at some stage, either through, there are different forms of assessment. They'll be looked at, there are 16 different forms of assessment. So they will be looking at the work from a point of view of either a witness statement, an observation, an assignment, a test, an exam, a group discussion, a role play. In some cases, it could be a case study. So you would be learning the techniques here to become a competent person who would be able to mark and assess work, which is primarily going to be related to helping the learner or student gain something called a skill. Or at the end of it, they are looking at gaining a particular skill. So in your case as well, when you're studying this particular qualification, your aim is to basically study a nationally recognized qualification, which is valued by employers and universities. And here it emphasizes that you are going to be able to work, mark, and assess students' work who are working and studying in different areas or disciplines or qualifications. And these qualifications essentially give them a skill. So, an example of this would be when I say vocational education, it tends to be, people who are going to prepare themselves for, say, for example, learning a skill. Now, somebody who's learning to do a welding course, somebody who's learning to doing a course to learn drama or music, they are at the end of it, when they enroll into that course, and obviously at the end of the completion of the course, they will be learning a skill, and that skill is going to be either able to play music or take participation in dramatics or drama, or in some cases, like I mentioned, if you're becoming a welding technician, then you'd be able to use and start working as a welding technician, plumber, electrician. So these are examples of vocational qualifications. And similarly, when you look at doing this assessor qualification, your main aim is that you're essentially looking at gaining a skill which will allow you to assess students' work in any particular form of qualification which requires you to audit or assess the work which is going to lead to a creation of a skill or learning a skill. Now, when I look at the course overall has 2 units in it. These are 2 units, which is first is theoretical unit, which is to understand principles and practices of assessment. So we'll go into detailing of starting this particular unit today, which is going to primarily focus on, giving you insight and knowledge about what are the various principles and concepts of assessment, what are the various types of assessment, how do you plan an assessment, and then looking into details like how do you involve learners and other practitioners into the form of assessments that you do, which is other colleagues who are also assessors, markers, people like IQA who essentially judge your assessment and look at best practices, and you being for you actually following the processes of the policies and processes which have been laid down. We will also look at understanding how assessment decisions tend to be valid, reliable, fair, sufficient, current, and obviously made against the specific criteria. We'll also be going into understanding in Unit 1 that how do we understand the role of assessment in the process of quality assurance. Because at the end of the day, when you mark papers, you mark assignments, or we look at assessing some work which is going to be graded or is going to get some sort of a let's say a grade from you or a judgment from you that this meets this criteria, then how does that particular judgment that you make play a role in the quality assessment processes in education in general? We'll also be looking at what are the legal and regulatory requirements when you do become an assessor and you start assessing learners' work. Then what are the bare minimum requirements that you need to follow in terms of making sure that your assessment decisions are accurate and they meet and conform with the guidelines of a particular body. Now, this conformance and guidelines for a particular body in this case could mean an awarding organization. When we look at schools, it tends to be offset. When we look at in general qualifications, it will be off call. And when we look at higher education, this is going to be quality assurance agency. The second unit is more going to be about when we do study this particular unit. The second unit is looking at assessing vocationally related skills and knowledge and understanding. So this particular part of it in the unit is totally practical. Here you would need at least two learners' work. You would be required to assess the learners, and most of the outcomes that you would see, if I just show you very briefly for the unit, they would primarily involve you having to practically do these tasks. So if I look at the first unit in the specification, you generally see that it normally is understand. Most of them are understand. That means they are theoretical. But if I look at the learning outcomes of the unit 2, which is what we're going to study, you would generally see that all the learning outcomes here are be able to make decision, be able to do this. So whatever we are going to learn in unit 1, we are going to actually put it into practice in the unit 2, which is where we will assess. That means you're actually practically going to be assessing how do we assess vocational skills, how do we judge and obviously look at knowledge, and then how do we put the understanding that we've got from unit 1 into practice essentially when we start working as an assessor. So there'll be some requirements in terms of basic requirements wherein you would need to have certain amount of work or certain learners work available to be able to practically then present this as evidence, and that practical evidence that you would be able to present would essentially allow you to pass the units. So this particular qualification is 10 credits. It's a certificate. I think it's an award, in assessing vocationally related achievement. And our idea is that if we are starting today, there are about 7 plus 4, 11 outcomes that we need to cover. So it will be approximately looking at 11 to 12 weeks to be able to complete this particular course. So in terms of delivery, we are looking at meeting every Sunday at 9 a.m. to cover one learning outcome. And at the end of it, at the back of it, what I'm also going to do is start giving you some templates that you can complete. And these templates essentially would allow you to also start adding them towards evidence in your assignment. So a simple enough unit that we're going to start off with today, which is primarily building on the theoretical concepts of how do we look at understanding the principles of assessment and practices which are generally put into place by the assessor. Now, today's learning outcome, what we are going to look at for this particular unit, just to specify, unit 1, we have about 7 learning outcomes here. And in these 7 learning outcomes, we're going to cover them in 8 sessions. So we are looking at most of June and our first or second week of July to be able to try and cover all these learning outcomes. And then we'll go into unit 2. Today, our focus is primarily to start with learning outcome 1, and it has 4 assessment criteria. And we are looking at covering this bit of, indicative content to start building our understanding of what are the processes of assessment, what is the role of the assessor, what are the principles that we follow, and we'll go into some of the details of understanding the principles and practices of assessment to lay down a foundation for studying this unit. So I'll move you over to a presentation slide, which is what we are going to be looking at discussing today. So in learning outcome 1, we are essentially focused on, so if you look at this particular unit, this unit is primarily a unit which people would study standalone as well in the teaching qualification, and their aim of studying this particular unit is to understand the process of assessments. Apart from what they're doing in terms of their teaching qualification, this unit forms an optional unit in the teaching suite of qualifications as well. And people specifically who are going into a higher education would essentially be looking at getting a basic understanding of the processes of assessment. They also study the IQA unit, which is understanding the principles and processes and practices of internal quality assurance. Because when you try and become a teacher and you take up a teaching qualification, you would need to understand the full 360-degree circle in terms of what teaching involves, what learning involves, what delivery involves, what assessment involves, and what quality assurance involves. So these first units in these qualifications tend to be theoretical, and they are based on frameworks, models, and they give you a bit of a foundation in terms of understanding what is the role of the assessor. Now, in terms of the indicative content here today, we are going to look at some of the basic key concepts and principles of assessment, which is the main part that we want to understand. And sometimes what we look at is within institutions, colleges, educational providers, what you'll generally see is that sometimes the curriculum manager or the program manager within that institution essentially ends up creating a bit of a theme. So this year, for example, at UK Versity, the theme is that most awarding bodies have refreshed qualifications, but most of the themes in terms of assessment are tending to be assignments, PowerPoint presentations, case studies, and handouts. Another form of theme could be that some institutions, universities in particular in higher education, have a combination of assignment and a test. So 60% of marks would be based on assignment, but 40% of the marks of the unit or a particular module would be based on synoptic assessment, which is a control test that the learners will need to take on the system. So once you start the test, you have to finish it. You do not get a second attempt to doing it. And some qualifications like law, teaching, nursing would have these kind of assessments. So there's a theme to it that you break it down into different forms of assessment of how you are going to run a particular program or a course within the organization or within an institution. So we're going to be learning about key themes. We'll also look at what are the responsibilities of assessor. Now, this is a direct question and a direct task. So here we want to be able to understand what are the various things that you do if you wear the assessor's hat. That means if you get into this particular role, what would be the responsibilities that you are expected to execute and expected to understand when you work as an assessor within the organization. And the last part of it would be to understand the regulations required to ensure that your assessments are current, they are valid, they are basically based on some sort of evidence, and that evidence can be clearly identified from a point of view of, if somebody is to challenge, for example, sometimes in graded qualifications, what tends to happen is if you assess the work, and when you do assess the work, what tends to happen is that if you give it a pass and the learner comes back and says, no, I deserve a merit, or I've done all my tasks and it needs to be a merit. So your assessment needs to be very clear in terms of identifying the evidence why you've awarded the work a pass mark or a merit mark or a distinction mark. And that is something that we will learn in the fourth part of the assessment criteria. Any questions on this so far?
No, it's okay.
Okay, so let's go into a bit of basic details to understand, what do we mean by, looking at assessor. So there are a couple of things that we want to understand first. One or two basic questions which come to our mind when we look at the role of assessor. So for example, when we do talk about what is an assessor, who's called an assessor, and what tends to be the role of the assessor or the responsibilities of the assessor, these are some basic questions which will come to your mind simply because of the fact that you are doing this particular qualification. So let's look at really briefly just understanding what could be the role of the assessor or who is called an assessor. Let's start with the second question first. Who's called an assessor? Any ideas, any thoughts on this?
I think who are able to mark the assignment very briefly or in a particular way.
Partly yes, partly correct. So people who, when we say who are called assessors, or what is the role of the assessor. So here we are basically looking at talking about people who are in a position wherein they are subject experts. They teach a particular subject area, and within that subject areas, they have the ability to be able to then evaluate the work which has been submitted, mark the work which has been submitted, assess the work which has been submitted. Various ways of saying it, but typically speaking, somebody who works or is called an assessor is a person, I would say, who is employed within a particular field, and that person within that particular subject area or field is able to essentially then look at, as an expert, the work which is presented, and that work essentially then can be assessed by him to say this meets the criteria. Just to give you an example before I show the definitions. So if I look at taking, say for example, you drive a car and the car runs into a bit of a problem, you take it to a mechanic shop or a workshop, and then the person who comes out and looks at the car and the problem, tries to diagnose the problem, is in that terminology called a mechanic, for example, because he's received training on it. But if I look at the basic work that the person carries out, the first thing that he's going to do in that car is to look at asking you a set of questions in terms of what was the problem, or why did it come to a standstill or a halt, or what is the reason, what did you do in terms of the things that it has led to this state. Then they would, after asking those basic questions, that person would go into looking into where the problem is and would try and diagnose the problem. So what the person here is essentially doing is, after finding out the problem, or the issue which is there, he or she would essentially go into finding out how does he, first find out what the problem is, and then look at the reasons behind that problem. And once the reasons behind the problems are identified, that person will go ahead and fix that particular problem. Now, after the problem is fixed, when the person hands it back to you, they will say, okay, please try and take care of this, or please try and take care of that, because that is what led to this particular issue. Although I've resolved it, now it is good to go. But in short, that tends to be the process. So if I look at applying that same bit in education, the person who looks at marking a script, then on that script or assignment or case study, whichever way we look at it, then gives a bit of a feedback to say this is why it meets the criteria, this is why it doesn't hit the criteria, is the person who's going to be assessing or checking the work. And in those cases, what you look at is a person being an assessor. Now, an assessor could also be somebody in the court of law, for example, a solicitor or somebody who presents the case. And in some cases, that person is a subject expert in that area in terms of immigration, or, say, family law or commercial law. And that person specifically would then advise the client in terms of how you would want this case to be pursued in the court of law. And in that case, that person also inevidently does the role of an assessor. So now when we look at the role of assessor, and the person who is the person, they are people who are essentially employed to calculate or value something. Now, this is something that we see across in all walks of life. You go to a gold jeweler, and the gold jeweler, you show them some sort of an ornament, and that person would essentially first weigh the ornament and then look at valuing the ornament depending on the price of gold or silver on that particular day. And then they would decide what amount of money is to be paid, because there'll be some part of it in terms of workmanship, or some part in terms of design and cost of labor that he will deduct. But apart from that, they would be able to tell you, okay, this is the money that you can get if you sell or pawn this particular item with us, as an item of gold or silver or whatever. Now, the role of assessor is doing assessments. That means you're always making judgments. You're always making judgments against the criteria which have been defined in a qualification. So the gold jeweler will essentially make a judgment in terms of the value of the, say, the product that you've given. As an example, if you've given them a chain or a ring, the assessment of that would be done on the basis of the weight and the current price of gold on that day in the market. So he's going to look at pricing the gold, saying the ounce is priced at, say, 370, 1 ounce is priced at 370 pounds. So you are pawning something or giving him something which is a ring, which is 10 grams in weight. Then he will accordingly look at the weight of that ring and then calculate the price. So what he's doing essentially is using the assessment criteria because he's not going to give money from his pocket. So he's using the assessment criteria, which is the rate of gold per gram on that day in the market, which is available. And against that, he'll calculate labor cost, material cost, any sort of deductions if they want to make, if the gold category is 24 carat, 22 carat, 20 carat, and basis that he will give you a price. So his aim as a person is showing what he does in his industry, which is in his sector as a gold merchant, as a person selling or buying gold. He is going to carry out an assessment to see what kind of gold it is, what quality it is, how much carat it is, and then basis the assessment criteria, he's going to give out a price. That is the role of the assessor. Now, if I look at that particular role in the field of education, you're going to look at a qualification, you have some qualification benchmarks, and with those benchmarks, you're going to look at criteria which are set by awarding organizations, regulators, and you would need to assess the work which is presented to you as an assignment, case study, as an exam, as a handout, or any form of assessment. You would basically look at then making a judgment to see whether that is meeting the criteria or not. Now, one other question which will come to your mind, which I think you should be asking yourself, is what are the roles and responsibilities of a person who works as an assessor? So, what is their role? What do they do on a day-to-day basis? What are the key things that they need to be aware of when we talk about the role and responsibilities of an assessor? So, this is a particular specific assessment criteria 1.3. We'll look at this in a bit more detail, but just very briefly here, the role of an assessor involves planning, delivering any sort of vocational training, qualification, or a course. In some cases, it is workshop. An example of workshop is boot camp. You typically go across, and if you want to do a project management qualification, or for example, you want to learn, sometimes what we do see is that people want to learn something about security equipment. They do a 1 day, 2 day course. They go to a specific place. They attend the training with the trainer, and it is normally done in groups. So in those cases, that will be termed as workshop or boot camps. So essentially, a role of the assessor would involve planning and delivering of the qualification. So you would go into details of what are the less schemes of work, what are the lesson plans, and how you would break that down, the unit down. Like I'm delivering one, which is this particular first unit. It has 7 learning outcomes, and I've broken it down into 8 sessions that I'm going to carry out. And each of these sessions, I'm going to do one learning outcome, hit all the assessment criteria, and we will do this through the process of presentation and discussion, and that is an example of planning and delivery. So here the assessor would be involved in planning and delivery. Sometimes assessors can be different from teachers or lecturers. They would only assess work, they would not be involved in teaching, but they would have some sort of an involvement in planning and delivery, or understand the planning and delivery of how this particular course and qualification is being done, so that when it comes to assessment, for that when it comes to marking of the work, they are clear in terms of how the marking process would work, how it needs to be turned around, what criteria you have to look at, what has been delivered in the class by the lecturer or the tutor, and they see a very good and they see a very transparent view of the expectations which have been set by the tutor, lecturer, or teacher in the class, and that is what is expected to be reflected in the assignment or some sort of work which the learners would submit, and that would be the process that they will need to follow and have assess and do assessments on them. Now, the process of assessment also involves observing and assessing candidate in their workplace. Now, this sometimes, is a process which is also called, I would say, endpoint assessment. So when we look at the process of endpoint assessment, that means some qualifications are give you an example of apprenticeships. So apprenticeships or vocational qualifications are such wherein sometimes you need to observe the candidate or the student or the learner at their place in their natural environment in terms of how they are doing the work. So in such cases, when you do observations as an assessor, and in by going into the workplace where the person is working, then in those cases these assessments sometimes are also called end point assessments. So these are when you are observing the candidate in its natural environment, And I would relate that to the example I gave earlier. Somebody who's doing a welding course or a plumbing course, or say, for example, a nursing course, what they would need to do is basically at some stage, in order to understand how they're working, what they've learned, and how they are putting it into practice, you would need to go to their workplace where they're having a placement or where they're actually doing these practicals, and then observe them doing the practicals and then make a judgment, and that would be endpoint assessment. You also look at interviewing candidates and examining their portfolios. So when we look at qualifications like creative arts, we look at qualifications like engineering, we look at qualifications related to, for example, areas wherein there's a practical component involved in studying those qualifications and gaining those skills. So in such cases, you look at examining their portfolio. Like you look at creative arts, somebody who's doing design, for example, or somebody who's learning Photoshop or digital designing, essentially, as we call them under creative arts. They would need to produce what is called a portfolio, and that portfolio is also examined to see whether they have understood the various aspects of how, what is calligraphy, how, what is fonts, how to arrange the structure, how to form storyboards. Those kind of things would involve portfolios. Portfolios can also be in the case of people who are studying law, people who are studying nursing, teaching. So your bit of the assessor program would involve examining a portfolio, and that portfolio will essentially mean that you have two learners at least that you're teaching, and in those two learners you're essentially assessing the work, and the work that the students submit, either as assignments, case studies, exams, or handouts, they will all be the evidence that you will need to showcase, and that would show that you have the good understanding of assessing students' work as well, and that would be some sort of portfolio of evidence that you will submit. Now, very briefly, if we go into the first assessment criteria, which is talking about, principles of assessment, I would very briefly mention this here because this is one of the direct assessment criteria as well. But when we do talk about principles of assessment, there are certain, if we look at somebody who's becoming an engineer, if we look at somebody who's becoming a doctor, somebody who's you're taking up a career, becoming a lawyer, but whatever it is, when you look at taking up something from a point of view of learning that qualification or getting into that qualification, what tends to happen is that you would be looking at falling back onto certain principles which have been defined, for that particular qualification. So when we talk about principles of assessment, we need to be aware of two particular models, and these two particular models, if I write it here, would be WARC and SMART. Now, these are two models on the basis of which most of the, I would say, um, effectiveness of assessment is judged on when you're examining something as a portfolio or when you're examining something as an assignment or some sort of an output of work. So these tend to be two important principles that you will learn. And these two principles that you're going to look at would be the fundamentals of how assessment of learning happens, how you develop as an assessor, and these are things that you will clearly follow through in terms of um, ensuring that you understand them, and that would allow you to always assess work, accurately or with the guidelines which have been specified by the awarding organizations. So first model that we look at is the principles of assessment tends to be the WARC model. This talks about validity, reliability. It talks about fairness of the assessment. C stands for currency, and S stands for looking at sufficiency. So when we look at sometimes these principles are written in a different format, but generally when I talk about the principles of assessment, what we are looking at is validity, authenticity, reliability, currency, and sufficiency. That is what WARC essentially stands for. So when we look at this particular model of assessment, when you do look at marking some work, or when you look at essentially taking into account work from the students, what you're going to essentially do is look at these 5 areas which are going to be related to the students' work, and you would identify these 5 areas. And if these 5 areas are covered, then you would basically go ahead and say that yes, the work submitted is absolutely okay, and then you would award this work, a pass mark. Now, there's a small video of it as well, which is principles of assessment. This is something that you can, watch offline. This video essentially would help summarize, primarily why assessments as a process is important and what are the basic principles required for you to be able to do assessment of, work. If you're provided any sort of work from a learner, from a student, from a point of view of a candidate, then how you go about assessing the work. Now, when you do the assessment of the work, what we are looking at is the work needs to follow these two principles. SMART stands for, when you're assessing the work that you have been given to assess needs to meet a specific criteria. So it has to be something which is specific, it has to be measurable, it has to be actual or accurate, it has to be realistic, and it has to be time bound. That means when somebody submits a work, submits an assignment, you would need to mark it within, say, depending on how it has been defined in the policy of the organization. Some organizations say 1 week, some say 2 weeks, some say 4 weeks. When you look at universities, because there's a process of moderation which will happen after the assessments have been gathered. Moderation would lead to an exam board, and at the end of it, the exam board would ratify the results in the grade, and then they will be communicated back to the learners. In an educational institution like college, which is in the FE space, you generally see that happening, wherein the IQA, the internal quality assurer, would actually pick up the work which is being assessed by the assessor, and that work he or she would ratify to say that the standards have been met, the assessment is fair, it is consistent, it is checking the sufficiency, it is also aligning to identifying the evidence, and that would allow and confirm the judgment that the grade finally awarded is correct, and the IQA will agree with that grade, and that would be something that you will then give across to the students to confirm that yes, your work has essentially passed. Now, when we look at the requirements of assessment, we need to understand what is it that you're going to assess. How are you going to look at? So everybody, as we say sometimes, the phrase everybody sings from the same songbook. So there are some guidelines that you will follow. These guidelines either could be program specification, which the college or the institution actually creates. It could be a course handbook. It could be guidelines which are laid down by awarding bodies through various policies and procedures. It could be regulatory guidelines that you need to be aware of, which is what you would adhere to. The awarding body will translate them into policies and procedures, and then the center or the institution would translate them into their own policies and adapt it, and that would be something that you would follow from a point of view of doing the assessment. So these assessments, when we look at, generally would follow certain requirements or guidelines, and they could be aligning with learning objectives. It could be, when I say comprehensive coverage, what I mean by that is the assessments cover the range of evidence which is required in that particular subject matter. They would also be diverse assessment. That means the assessment methods could be of different types. This is what we will look at in one of the assessment criteria. There are 16 different forms of assessment methods. So sometimes colleges, institutions, schools, or FE colleges change the modes of assessment in order to avoid secondary plagiarism and to give opportunities to learners with specific requirements to be able to also have equal opportunities to achieve that qualification. So, just as an example, if somebody is severely dyslexic and they are not able to write, then sometimes the adjustments in the assessments have to be done in a way wherein you allow the inclusion of a scribe, somebody who's able to come in and write on their behalf of what the material or what is being narrated by the learner, because they have dyslexia and they are not able to concentrate or write regarding assignments. So in such cases you would allow adjustments to happen, and that is where the methods of assessment would change. Now if it allows you to assess the learner's knowledge that they've gained by doing an interview, by doing a group discussion, or asking them to present something verbally rather than writing, then in that case you would use a different assessment method. But at the same time, using that different assessment method, you'll follow the same assessment criteria which are designed some of the students are writing an assignment, but this particular student, because of the disability or the special requirements, is allowed to make a presentation. But in such cases, the presentation still conforms to the assessment criteria or guidelines which are specified by the awarding body, and the learner is required to hit that. The only difference here is when I've chosen the change of having the mode of assessment, I have moved from doing an assignment, which is a write up kind of a task, to essentially presenting, but the presentation would still be made by the learner. In some cases, even that would be allowed, that would be made by somebody who, I will give the ideas, I will narrate everything, but somebody else is going to do the typing and make it. And then I present it, and I would present it in detail, which will help me hit all those criteria. So, diverse assessment methods can be used. Now, some assessments that we do, feedback that we give can be two types: formative and summative. Formative tends to be ongoing. Summative tends to be towards the end of the unit or end of the subject that you complete, and module that you complete and achieve. So summative assessments and formative assessments can be given in different formats. Formative assessment tend to take part of things like multiple choice questions, quizzes, short answer questions, discussions, role plays. They typically tend to happen in a classroom based environment. It would happen with you and me when we are doing this session and I'm asking a few questions, and that is basically helping you confirm what I'm actually teaching, or doubts that you want to, do away with. And those are the bits I would do feedback on. Summative tend to be final exams or final assessments that would grade your work, and they would essentially be, done towards the end of the unit or the module that you have studied. Now, there could be different forms of feedback mechanism. As an assessor, we need to know that the assessment process can provide feedback which is in different formats. It could be verbal format feedback, it could be written feedback, it could be feedback which is predominantly given uh, if you have learners doing activities, combined activities wherein you have to identify individual learners' work. So it could be in the form of observation reports, it could be in the form of witness statements, and this tends to be the broader remit of how an endpoint assessments. If you go to the place of work where the learner is going to show practicality of what they've learned, then in those cases these tend to be the outlets through which you do practical or feedback. Now, when we look at the frameworks, which is important in terms of what does this involved from a theoretical point of view? Do how did the assessments come into play? So when we do talk about the assessments coming into play and the background behind the theoretical frameworks, which is basically what we need to know briefly, is that there are different concepts and studies, and different models which are proposed over the years, and some of these models have now got accepted, and these models now form the foundation or the theoretical frameworks of how the assessment processes work. So when we talk about assessment, one of the process that we talked about, in terms of theory, is the Biggs theory of 1996, which which talks about basically constructivist or constructive, alignment of the student work. And this bit, was essentially proposed by, John Biggs in the 1990s. And he talked about by, obviously doing a lot of studies, talking about that, in terms of his work that he did, his basic idea of the constructive alignment was a phrase which he coined, which actually defines an approach that when we design a curriculum, the curriculum design that is done by the, say, for example, the institution, it should be done in a way wherein it emphasizes the alignment of, learning, teaching, delivery. The delivery would involve activities and resources, and they then can inform the assessor in terms of what tasks and learning outcomes have to be looked at for the purposes of confirming judgments. So in a way, in short, what he did was, when we look at today all qualifications being designed in the format of learning outcomes and assessment criteria, he laid down the foundation of this particular bit, wherein he said that the notion, when learners construct their own learning, that needs to be done through relevant activities and resources which are provided by the teacher in the classroom or a classroom based setting. And that environment which gets created then allows for equal learning opportunities, for all learners. And when they look at in learning opportunities, they have to be defined in relation to what are called learning outcomes. So we need to know exactly what output or what end result, if I put it, aims and objectives have to be achieved at the end of it. When teaching is done, when delivery is done, when assessment is done, they all need to conform or sing to the same songbook. And that is where the constructive alignment theory, came about from, John Briggs. Then we also have the assessment for learning. Now, the assessment for learning means that there was an emphasis of this part by Black and William on the fact that assessment should promote, finally, should also be looking at promoting learning of the student. It should not involve that you are making judgments and you are essentially, you know, looking at making judgments from a point of view of just telling whether the learner has met the criteria or not. But assessment of learning is what they proposed, is that it's a process that the learners will go through, the students will go through, the teachers will follow that process, adjust their teaching strategies and the feedback in such a way that it allows learners to be motivated during the process of learning. So sometimes we refer to this, AFL part as an ongoing process through which generally assessments are done. And this allows learners to participate, be motivated, and at some stage, also achieve the goals and objectives which have been set. So this part through which it's an approach which was proposed by Black and William. It's a pedagogical approach which basically allows the focus of learning to gather feedback essentially, and that feedback should inform the teachers or the educators who are delivering that process to say that this is the area where the students' performance need to be enhanced. This is the area that we need to work on to improve the performance of the student, and this is an ongoing process. And then the last bit that we talk about, is the solo taxonomy. So when we talk about solo taxonomy and solo learning, also sometimes it is called, what we are basically meaning in this case is that this was again developed by Briggs and Collis. Now, this particular model describes how the increasing complexity of students' thinking and understanding changes at the level at which they are doing courses. So, what Briggs and Collin actually worked on in the 1980s, they basically said that different students or different learners at different ages of their learning can learn different range of, let's say, um, they can learn different, range of subject areas. For example, they would be essentially looking at, they define what are called the five hierarchical levels. So when they did their work, essentially what solo taxonomy did was that it basically structured the learning of a learner into five different, areas. And these five different areas typically, meant that sometimes the work can be done, or learning can be essentially done in aspects of unistructural, multistructural, relational, and extended abstract constructs. So this particular framework, which wherein he, along with Collins, actually proposed that when learning starts. So simple example here is kids in the nursery, would only be able to do certain amount of things. When they go to key stage one, they would do certain amount of learning. Then they do to key stage two, key stage three, the learning would change at different levels. So here, what solo taxonomy essentially, or this particular model did, was that when they carried out this study, the aim was to compare the impact of case-based learning and lecture-based learning on different types of students in, say, for example, different years of their growth. And the focus of this particular study was to design assessments which can target problem solving, cognitive abilities, and the understanding of the student at that particular level. So, an example of this would be that if I'm assessing a work for a nursery student or a key stage one student, I'm going to be assessing a portfolio work, which is what they do. Say, for example, they start to understand letters, they start to make words, then they start writing. And what we are assessing across the year would be at the end, I would, as a teacher, look at how they have grown throughout the year to be able to finally write words and write essentially at year two and year three. And they are using capital letters or they are joining the words. And that is what the phase of journey that you will look at. And in such cases, the modes of assessments will need to be meeting that requirement at that level. Now, I cannot say that that student would do an assignment or a test because that is something that they've not been trained and it is not designed for that particular level. So here the goal and the essence was essentially focused on the fact that when you design assessments, they need to be at the appropriate level, and that level to which you are defining the assessment should be able to test the depth of the knowledge of the student that they have gained by studying that course. A simple example that I will also give you here is when I look at level 3 course and I look at a level 7 course, I should have assessments defined for level 3 at that level wherein the learner's understanding would be meeting and conforming to the requirements at level 3. I cannot design assessments at a higher level because that will be unfair. So, understanding that what we are teaching, what we are delivering, what resources we are providing to the learners should also be informing what kind of assessments are to be set. And that part of the assessment process and the resources part of it, which was structured as solo, taxonomy, and that is where this bit in terms of comes across wherein the learning progresses as the learning progresses as we say because it becomes more complex, and solo essentially allows us to understand the structure of the observed learning outcome. So if you were to ask me what is the full form of solo, structured observed learning outcomes. And that is where you would look at designing assessments at a particular level, and they would be the theoretical parts that we would need to look at in terms of understanding, I would say, how do we design assessments and are these assessments defined at a particular level, which is what the learners would not would find it suitable. I would not say the word difficult, but they would find it suitable at that level to be able to study. So that allows you to get a very good insight into what this process of assessment is, role of assessor is, what are the key principles that you look at, just like an overarching introduction to the whole qualification, which is why do you need to do assessment, how would you do the assessment, who's the assessor, what is the role of the assessor, and how the assessments are designed so that you are able to assess them at a particular level of the course and competency of the learner at that particular course. Any questions on this so far?
No, all good.
All right. Okay. So let's get into some of the assessment criteria quite quickly to understand how we would then implement some of these, because what we've discussed is covered in some of the assessment criteria. Now, the first part talks about key concepts and principles of assessment. So here is what we need to do is apply the WARC model. So I'll give you a simple example here. Now, most of us work within the sector wherein we are assessing assignments. Now, when we look at the implementation of the concepts of assessment, we need to follow WARC. What is WARC? Now, validity. Now, validity of the assessment basically means that at some stage you are judging or assessing something which is basically related to an assessment criteria or a learning outcome. Reliability part of it is that when the work is being produced and submitted for the purposes of assessment, the work essentially tends to be one, authentic. Authentic is A. One tends to be authentic because that is the work which has been produced by the learner themselves. So in our case, we have what is called a declaration of originality, wherein we ask the learners to sign, for example, that this is their own piece of work. They've not colluded or worked with anybody to produce this work. They've referenced the work, and they have given credits or use referencing to give credit to the authors or places where they've taken the work from. So validity and authenticity, reliability tends to be that the work is assessed across by different assessors, but the reliability part of it tends to be that here what you're looking at essentially is ensuring that the work that you are assessing is basically going to be reliable in the sense that your judgments that you're making are going to be reliable from a point of view of meeting the expectations of the awarding body's criteria. So when I say principles of assessment and when we talk about reliable, the work is consistent over time. That means your ability to be able to judge the work is consistent over time, depending on it doesn't depend on how what work is provided or how many times you assess the same unit for different learners. You are reliable from a point of view of having consistency over time. Now, when we talk about currency, one of the things that we look at currency is current. That means the work that is being observed is ensuring that when you do the assessments or the work as an assessor, the assessments reflect the current standard and practices. So you are looking at the actual standards and practices which are defined in the qualification in a particular unit. And what you're looking at essentially doing is ensuring that the work that you're assessing is to the current standards. Now, I'll give you a simple example here. Sometimes when you see a awarding body change their assignment briefs, they change their unit specification. Now you also need to be updated on those changes. You need to be updated on, the specification changes which tend to happen. And in such cases, what you're looking at is if the work, I'll give you a broad example. Over the years, the focus has moved from individual assessments to holistic assessments. Now, what does that mean? And where do you understand currency and currentness of reliability? Now, earlier the tasks were set out as P1, P2, P3, P4, M1, M2, D1, D2. That means pass, merit, and different opportunities were very clearly defined. Now the assessments tend to follow what is called holistic, routines. That means what you'll do is you'll give a detailed scenario of the assignment, and that scenario will have certain tasks. Those tasks will have to be done wherein you do not define, for example, that this is P1 or this is task 1.1, this is task 1.2. At the end of the assignment, you summarize this in the form of assessment criteria and you provide an assessment grid. And the learners then go about attempting the task. Now, the fundamental difference in this case was that when we assessed assignments and work 10 years earlier or 15 years earlier, what used to happen was the learners were very clear that I only want to achieve a pass, merit, and distinction, and they used to only attempt those tasks. They were not making the additional attempts to actually going and trying to achieve a higher grade. Now, the holistic assessments focus on the fact that you're looking at securing the achievement, from a point of view of ensuring that the learners are given opportunities to achieve higher grades. So, holistic or integrated assessments, that they are called, they are focused on the entire work, not a piece of work or a specific element of the work. So, if these standards have changed over the years, you need to be, as an assessor, able to understand what is the currency. That means the current standards and practices to which you need to assess. And then last but not the least, we look at sufficiency. So when we talk about sufficiency, what we are looking at is in sufficiency, we are basically focused on the fact that the evidence presented by the learner is sufficient to meet the requirements of that task. So one of the tasks says, explain the key concepts and principles of assessment. Now, what you'll do is basically in this task, go about explaining the model work and the model smart, and towards the end, give an example. Now, as long as you've done the definition of work and the definition of smart, explain each of the components, and then towards the end, explained it with an example, that would meet the sufficiency of the assessment criteria. Because the command verb you've looked at, and then you've written enough and provided enough evidence which allows that there is enough evidence provided by the learner to say that they have understood the question, and then the evidence which has been provided confirms the learner's achievement, and that would be termed as sufficiency. And then when we look at essentially talking about the various parts of it in terms of principles of assessment that we talk about, sometimes they tend to be 6, sometimes they tend to be 8, but generally speaking, these are the key principles that you would normally look at when we talk about the principles of assessment. And that is what I would suggest that we need to be aware of when we are essentially checking, marking, looking at learners work at different stages, and they constitute what are called the principles. Now, they could be diverse or different methods. These methods would vary on the different types of assessment required for qualification. As I mentioned earlier, if somebody is learning to be a plumber or a welding expert, or say, for example, a nurse, some part of the components could be theoretically assessed in the first year, but the second year would involve assessment at the place of work. They would be observed at the place of work, and that is where the assessment methods would essentially change. Now, this table defines here the different forms of assessment methods that you would generally see, which are being employed by, you as an assessor. And they tend to follow some sorts of concepts and principles which have been developed to assess different forms of qualifications. So if you're doing an academic qualification, you might have some forms of assessment. If you're doing vocational qualification, it'll have some forms of assessment. If you're doing an endpoint assessment of a qualification or a unit or a subject area, then they would follow different forms of assessment methods. And they are what are generally considered as eight main concepts or key areas of functions of, as I could call it, and principles of assessment in learning and development, which you have to consider as a assessor. Is that okay? Now, just very briefly going into the second assessment criteria, which talks about, outlining the key themes. Now, when I talked about outlining the key themes of assessment, what I meant here very briefly was that when we look at how do we, say, for example, plan the whole process across the year, you are going to be looking at certain areas of how these are going to be planned. So when we talk about the eight main principles of assessment, which involve, the WARC model and the SMART model, what we are going to do is translate them into what are called the, themes of assessment. Now, when we look at the themes of assessment, and when we say themes which are based on how you're going to look at, let's say, going about undertaking the assessment, then in such cases, what you will look at is that in some places, these key themes would tend to be on the fact that it is going to be primarily assignments, it is going to be primarily, case studies, it is going to be primarily tests, it's going to be a combination of some of these methods. And when we talk about these key themes in relation to principles of assessment, we translate them into, essentially 4 or 5 areas. And these 4 or 5 areas, if I look at in terms of themes, they tend to follow this pattern. That means when we assess, we are making sure our ethical standards are, implemented in the assessment process. We are fair as an assessor. I cannot say you're my favorite student and I'll give you this mark, or I'll be lenient for you in terms of assessment, but I would be stringent in terms of assessment for somebody else. No, you look at fairness across the process when you carry out assessments. You look at sufficiency, you look at validity, reliability, currency, authenticity, and you look at also checking the learning outcomes and the domains required for for ensuring. When I say domains, what I mean by that is you're looking at essentially following guidelines and standards which have been set forward by the awarding organization. And in such cases, when you follow this as a process, to assess the work, what you're doing is you're following the themes which have been set as principles and concepts in assessment. And that is what it means that when you say outline key themes from research on the principles of assessment. Is that okay? So this bit here tends to be you're
Yeah.
looking at the key areas of how you would go about planning your assessment process. So you're going to be fair, you're going to be consistent, you're going to be looking at following the standards, you have a very good understanding of the requirements of the assessment, and last but not the least, you're ensuring that the evidence that you're going to assess is going to be current, reliable, authentic, and it is going to be valid as far as the assessment is concerned. So those tend to be the themes which assessors or organizations would need to have, and they tend to be themes which are defined at the start of the curriculum. So for example, when universities start courses in February and September, there would be a process that they would discuss with all the assessors, and what they will do is set a theme that this year most of the assessments that we're going to do are on the basis of assignments. It is going to be done by so many people. You'll do some sort of a basic planning, and that planning would be done on these 7 core themes of making sure they are ethical, they are fair, they are authentic, they are essentially going to be taking into account standards and regulatory standards required for you to assess at that level. Now, the next assessment criteria define the responsibilities of assessor. Now, this is something that we covered very briefly earlier, but generally speaking, when we are looking at defining the responsibilities of assessor, what we are looking at is they play a very critical and an important part in the whole process of teaching, learning, and delivery part of it within any institution. So the role of assessor in the assessment process tends to be a responsible one, because they are the ones which are essentially responsible for finally acknowledging whether the learner and the candidate has achieved the particular task unit or qualification or not. So when we look at broadly the responsibilities of assessor, we are looking at they are involved in planning, managing, and delivering assessments. They are looking at ensuring there is integrity of delivering these assessments within qualification. They conduct assessments at different level. They are checking, monitoring, documenting, and obviously helping the learners get developmental feedback so they are able to progress. And they collaborate with other colleagues within the organization, whether it's quality assurance, whether it's teachers, tutors, program managers, curriculum managers, and they have a very good overall understanding of the part of how this process is being run. And they play their role in terms of assessing either evidences or portfolios, work, or assignments, whichever way you look at it, but they are the ones which provide feedback and advise and developmental feedback to essentially learners. So when we look at their role in a broader sense, and we look at the roles and responsibilities of the assessor, there could be lots of different things. But generally, where if I have to put it this way, these are the bits that I've highlighted here, which is, for example, they're involved in planning, they're involved in assessing, they're involved in providing feedback, they are involved in administering assessments, they are looking at grading and scoring if the qualifications are graded, and then they are also recording the feedback, which then can be at a later stage checked by the quality manager, or it can be triangulated as evidence when regulatory authorities come in from a point of view of inspections. So they look at maintaining the standards, they look at essentially recording the results, they look at assessing, they look at planning side of things, they look at ensuring that the feedback which is provided to the learners is developmental, and overall their responsibility is that the learner should be able to submit work which is organized, which is clear, and it provides a clear example of why they have achieved this particular learning outcome or a unit. And they are able to conform to awarding body criteria because they have a good understanding as a subject expert, and that would be the role of the assessor. So in short, a couple of points in terms of what we need to know as a role of the assessor, and they would tend to be looking at planning, maintaining the integrity of qualifications so that assessments are not compromised. You're not giving off the grades before they are being ratified by the IQA or the examination board. You're ensuring that the assessment that you do is meeting the requirements of the awarding body and the regulatory standards in terms of the key descriptors defined in the qualification. You're not marking as lenient or as borderline cases and then awarding grades. You're looking at obviously developing, monitoring, and keeping yourself up to date with the standards if they are changing in the qualification or the course. And you're providing feedback which is developmental for learners so that they are able to learn and they are able to, progress in the qualification that they're doing. And that would generally be the example of what the role of assessor is. So I've explained that in a couple of slides by taking a few discussion points which you can go through. The last part that we want to cover today, I know we've overextended the session, but just the last part that we want to cover today in the learning outcome is we want to understand what are the regulations and requirements essentially from a point of view of you being able to follow this. When I say follow the assessment side of things within HE or higher education, because it talks about own area of practice. So what I've done is I've taken, higher education because I'm teaching in higher education. So here, the main part that we need to understand and explain is that what are the regulatory requirements that are relevant to the assessment that I undertake in my own area of practice. That means if I'm a teacher for strategic management and leadership and HRM, my areas of assessment would typically be in the subject field of strategic management in general. Now, here, what I need to be doing is before I assess any material or any work, I need to be a subject expert. That means I need to have relevant knowledge in that area. I need to know what are the key regulatory and standards and requirements specifically for this qualification. At some stage, what I would also look at primarily at my end would be to also understand, you know, what could be different policies and procedures which the college has or the institution has that I need to follow. And last but not the least, I also need to have the resources to be able to assess that qualification accurately and make judgments which are going to be consistent, fair, and valid when they are audited by, say, the quality manager, or in some cases, the regulatory bodies like, the awarding organizations, their external examiners in such cases. So when I look at that bit, I'm going to be looking at these 5 areas that I would need to ensure that I'm updated with in order to say that I am employing the assessments, via a particular strategy in my own area of practice, and they are consistent, fair, and accurate and authentic as far as the judgments that I provide. So, one, if I need to recap, you need to be aware of regulation and legislation. So sometimes this tends to be in the form of guidance given by awarding bodies. So the course handbook, when I assess an assignment, there are assessor guidelines given for the assignments towards the end of the assignment brief. In universities, this tends to be the Rubik's Cube, which will allow and inform the assessor that these are the standards that you need to look at for the purposes of assessment of the qualification or of the purpose, for that particular unit. And that is what I have a good understanding of. Then I know the policies and procedures which are required, to conform to assessment. For example, the policies and procedures could be that I need to obviously look at data protection. I need to make sure equality and diversity I'm looking at following. I'm also following some of the standards which are given in the awarding body guidelines, things like concepts of plagiarism, similarity. I'm looking at their grading criteria or a grading structure which has been defined. And those are the standards and the awarding body guidelines which are translated into policies and procedures that I'm aware of before I start undertaking any assessments. Then I look at some of the professional requirements which are there in order to assess the work. And these professional requirements would be understanding the key descriptors, the learning outcomes, following the assessor guidelines which are given in the assignment briefs, and those are the bits that we'll be looking at to ensure that I understand those requirements and what is expected for me from that requirements to assess and how to assess that work. Now, when I do the assessments, I'm also going to be fair, and I say consistent. Those mean that you're not discriminating any against any learner's work. You're being fair, and you're uh, giving equal opportunities, and you're working and assessing each work independently based on that criteria. And last but not the least, when I look at the bits in terms of regulatory frameworks that I would say that I understand and I know quite well, what I would be doing is making sure my assessment is following the principles and the concepts which are laid down for the processes, for the purposes of assessments that I carry out. So those principles of WARC model, which I talk about, validity, authenticity, reliability, currency, and sufficiency, is something that I look at in grading the learner's performance. And these are basic principles, that I follow as far as monitoring assessments by meeting the regulation and requirements in the relevant area. So in my case, the higher education, in my case, the role of, this in the context of strategic management. So this table essentially summarizes. So if I look at institutional policies and guidelines, you would need to understand what is an assessment cycle, what is the assessment process. You would understand policies and procedures of what is assessor malpractice, what is the assessment policy within the organization, how assessments are designed, and what purpose the assessments serve for learners. When we look at institutions like universities, they follow certain standards laid down by Quality Assurance Agency, and there these standards are linked to the program specification which the university runs. So it's a three-year degree program. How many modules are taught? What they would be teaching in those modules? How the assessment or the assignments would be judged? What would be the process through which it will go through? And those are defined in that particular area. Now, the FHEQ is the framework for higher education qualifications. This is a framework which a lot of institutions follow, and this framework, lays down the foundation for key descriptors, the qualification at different levels, and why they are at different levels by highlighting learning outcomes and assessment criteria. You look at GDPR, equality and diversity policy, discrimination policy, basically policies at the institutional level, college level, university level, whichever institution you're teaching in, and then assessing the work. And then professional body requirements tend to be awarding bodies. So you're looking at, all these courses being accredited by off-call. Off-calls guidelines are translated into guidelines and policy procedures for awarding organizations. They then provide us templates, and those templates are then used by your institution, like in this case, UK Versity, to create our own policies related to assessment, IQA, internal verification, malpractice policy, looking at student complaint policy, looking at, assessor malpractice policy. And these policies are, by these policies, we can say that we are meeting the professional body requirements. Then you have external examiners who come in and check the work, and their aim is also to ensure that the work which is being checked internally by assessors is meeting the principles and requirements of the assessment, which is again going back to the principles of reliability, validity, accuracy, and fairness and currency and sufficiency being applied. And then when we talk about academic integrity policies, here we look at assessor misconduct. Sometimes we do see in places wherein the assessor, also can fall prey to misconduct. That means they collude with the students to be able to help them achieve a particular grade, or do the assignments, or do the assessment, assignments in a way wherein the assessments can be biased. So in such cases, we look at academic misconduct policies, and those will also be the requirements that you would need to understand in your own area of practice. So in our case at UK Versity, we have an academic misconduct policy wherein assessors or teachers or tutors are being, extraordinarily lenient with learners. We also have a malpractice policy, which is on plagiarism. And these are bits of policies that you need to understand, that when you assess work, your assessment of work has to have the highest level of integrity, and it cannot fall prey to any sort of malpractice. And they would be the bits that you would need to understand from a point of view of following relevant regulation and requirements to assess in your own area of practice. And that is what I've explained in these slides. So that brings us to the end of today's session, in which we have covered learning outcome 1, which is understanding the principles and requirements of assessment. And we've also looked at the 4 assessment criteria, which are essentially related with this learning outcome. So at this stage, if you have any questions, please feel free to ask me. Any questions at this stage? Right. Okay. If there are no more questions, then that's absolutely fine. What I'm going to do is obviously then end the session today, and we'll meet again in the next session. And what I would then do is primarily take on learning outcome 2. This presentation and some of the handouts and templates is what I'm going to upload on Moodle. So feel free to go through them in order to understand and read a bit more about it in terms of, crystallizing and let's say going into a bit of detail in terms of what we have covered today. So thanks so much for joining, and I'll see you next time. Bye for now.